Hello everyone, welcome to Biosphere Dreaming. I'm really proud to introduce to you our panelists today and also the participants of the exhibition. We have Jacob Lillemus here, who is a writer and a curator based in Denmark, Copenhagen. He recently curated the Danish Pavilion at the Venice Biennial and published the novel Architecture Zero, which you can see up here, and we have copies by the exhibition desk as well. And the book is his first novel, your debut, and incorporates references to Biosphere 2, which is Mark Nelson's project. Mark Nelson, who is here with us today, was part of the first crew of 8 Biospherians who lived inside the Biosphere 2, an experiment that took place for 2 full years. He's an engineer and the founding director of the Institute of Ecotechnics. He has published the books Pushing Our Limit, Insights from Biosphere 2, which was published in 2018. The Wastewater Gardener, which was published in 2014. And Life Under Glass, whose second edition is undergoing. And it was published in 2022 by a foreword by Sylvia Earle. Mark is joining us from New Mexico. Michael Garfield is there on Zoom. Michael writes music for Which New Words Must We Invented? Simultaneously tender and apocalyptic, intensely technical yet vulnerable, his tunes marry the singer-songwriter and electronic live producer, updating solo artists with guitar to suit an age of planetary renaissance. Committed to adventurous venues and collaborations, Garfield has played everywhere from Portugal to Australia, Canada to Costa Rica, Arcosanti to Moogfest, Synergy Ranch to Meewolf to the Chapel of Sacred Mirrors. His experience includes residencies in Austin, Santa Fe, and Black Rock City, concerts at the Dallas Museum of Nature and Science, the Santa Fe Institute, and the MAP Psychedelic Science Conference, and features on PBS in numerous acclaimed documentary films. And Mark composed the sound piece that's in the gallery. We would like to keep the presentations short so that we can have a lively panel. And without further ado, I think I'm going to have you, Jacob, for your presentation.
Thanks so much, Pinar. Thanks, Trish, for hosting. Thanks to the university for inviting. I was originally invited by Pinar based on the novel here to curate a show for the gallery. And I thought what to do. And I thought for this occasion I'd just briefly give you an idea of why it ended up being a show about Biosphere 2. Architecture Zero is a thriller. Basically, it's a piece of fiction, but it originates in research that I did at the University of Copenhagen at a research center for disaster management. And instead of my research was as a curator, a postdoctoral curator, and was based on running a gallery. I founded a little gallery space, and over 2.5 years I did a number of projects there. And for some reason, a lot of those projects ended up being about architecture. So when I closed the gallery in 2017, I was left with all this material about disasters and architecture, and I thought, okay, I need to do something with it. And that eventually came up with this, that became this book that you can read if you feel like it. But I'll give you a little bit an idea of what the novel is about. Basically, it asks this question, or doesn't ask this question. It goes into this idea that if we live in a world that's haunted by disasters or coming undone, architects will somehow needs to deal with these facts. And the book ventures into this problem or this situation and goes along two paths. I should say one path is dealing with the horror by protecting humans against the changes that comes with the horror. And you look to projects like this. This is an unrealized project by the city planner Oscar Newman from 1969. It's a nuclear bunker blasted out in the rock under Manhattan with nuclear weapons. It's kind of an ironic project. But this way of like continuing to live the life we live now, just several meters underground in this kind of this kind of dome with Coca-Cola signs on the dome. Fascinating project, scary as well. Then there are other projects like this, the seed bank in Svalbard in northern Norway, where seeds from plants all over the world are kept, so they will be able to grow them again in the case some of them grow extinct or there's other needs for them. Super fascinating project, I think. And then there is kind of this project where a billionaire decided to make like his own little fortress that can close entirely in on itself and become just a cube of concrete, and no outsiders can enter in any way. So this is kind of the paranoid vision of dealing with the horror. The one that's driven by fear, I guess you could say. But there's another way that the novel kind of deals with, and that's the kind of more progressive way that says, okay, what the changes that comes with the horror, what if we change our way of thinking and building with that, with those changes. This is a house built by an architect called Eugene Tsui. It's called the Fish House. It's in California. It's apart from just looking strange in its aesthetics, it's also pretty interesting in the sense that it's a house that he built for his parents who were moving to California. They were afraid of earthquakes. So he built this house. He wanted to build a house for them that was earthquake safe. And the way he went about it was to get inspiration from the tardigrade, this little super survivalist creature that can even go into space. So the construction itself of the house is based on the tardigrade. On top of that, the building materials are from nature, mainly cactus based. So it also has a kind of fireproof dimension to it. So it's also safe against forest fires. And I think this is the way of just looking to nature rather than trying to protect oneself against it. And all these ideas then led me to a project that I had known for some years and that I was really fascinated with, which is Biosphere 2. This amazing complex in Arizona that looks with a vision towards the changes that are coming and tries to imagine new ways of dealing with the challenges that primarily climate or ecological crises pose. And I think what was really interesting when I wrote the book, it started out as being a really dystopic novel, but I couldn't really help myself but ending with this. This project really, I think, changed the ending of the novel quite a lot in a more visionary direction. So I would say that although the book is a horror novel in many ways, it does have an opening to a sequel that holds promise for other ways of building that's not based on fear, but that's based on hope. And I think that's one of the topics we could talk about today. So I'm really glad that Mark said yes to doing this show when I invited you. There could be several exhibitions made about Biosphere 2. Some has already been made. I've even made other exhibitions about Biosphere 2, but the exhibition that you're seeing today is an exhibition based on Mark's writings, both his diary from the 2 years he lived inside Biosphere 2, from his dream diary, which is why the show is called Dreaming, Biosphere Dreaming, sorry, and then some poems he also wrote. And I think that was really, for me, interesting to rediscover those writings and to see both the poetry and the science, how they go together in defining this project. Because I think what stands out to me about Biosphere 2 is that it's a work of science and a work of the imagination at the same time. And I don't think you can have one or the other separated. So in that way, it's for me still deeply visionary. And I think I'm just beginning to discover the potential of this totally wild experiment. And I hope people here will also see the potential it still holds 30 years after Mark and his fellow crew members re-entered Earth's biosphere back in 1993. So with that said, I will stop here and give the word to, I don't know if it's going to be Michael or Mark. Maybe Michael?
That works for me, unless Mark wants to go. Yeah, so this has been an extraordinary project, and a big piece of the excitement for me behind this project has been so it really ties together. Biosphere 2 is a focal point of so many different threads running through the history of the 20th and 21st century, and the growing understanding of our place in the planet, and the growing relationship that we have to our technologies, as well as to the living non-human realm. And so, I want to, if I just share screen here. Oh, nope. But I'll tell you a couple precedents that I think matter here. One is the Crystal Palace exhibition in London in 1851. My favorite historian, William Irwin Thompson, was always on about how that marked a turning point, because that was the point at which the park was brought within the building and into the scaffolding of the structure. And around the same time, potted plants became a domestic phenomenon, in the way that they are now. And it's like, so that's one piece of this, is like us understanding that this view of trying to keep the world out that we had inherited from walled cities, and the myth of Actaeon, leaving dashing off into the wilderness, and then stumbling upon Artemis and the nymphs, and trespassing upon the domain of the gods, and then being turned into a stag and eaten by his dogs. that like clear boundary between like culture is here, nature is over here is gone. It's gone now. And we're folding more and more of this stuff into our homes, right? Like the plants in the house. You want this. So yeah, that's a piece. And then as far as just like my musical stuff is concerned, I was really keen on making this project something that was fit in form and spirit to what was going on with Biosphere 2. And that means messy, iterative, pulling, sampling life forms, organisms from all over the world. Like, build a coral reef in a desert, a rainforest in a desert, to do these things. So I, pulling together all the years and years of field recordings I took in the United States and in Australia, and, like the sonogram, like not the sonogram, the ultrasound of my daughter's heartbeat is in there. The waters of Ojo Caliente, kookaburras, and just mulching it, treating it like thinking like a farmer, thinking like someone who is working with the medium, the land, the material, and is one with this stuff. And I can show you real before I turn it over to Mark. Just I don't know how easily there's the studio. There's my cyber guitar corner in my office where I have a stupid amount of equipment set up for this, and where I spent weeks just up late every night working on this. So I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad to be in conversation with these people. Thanks. And Mark?
Do it from there? Yeah, you can do that.
Well, I do want to keep my comments brief so we have time for conversation. And that's hard because I like writing. I love words. Biosphere 2, let me just put it a little bit in context. It's an outrageous project. It shouldn't have been done. No rational person or group or institution would ever do it. And we've seen now that Biosphere 2 has been taken over by universities, how they've kind of downscaled their ambitions. Biosphere 2, I think, will rank as one of the landmark, most important ecological experiments of the 20th and now the 21st century. When we were building it, we were told we're 50 years ahead of our time. It's 30 years, and I'm not quite sure. I think if Biosphere 2 was now announced to the world, people wouldn't be that befuddled. Because essentially it was an experiment in how and if people, technology, and a wide variety of species and biomes could actually, come to some kind of a harmony in a man-made or human-made, tightly sealed facility. And as has been mentioned, it took sheer genius, lunacy, and imagination to say, well, not only are we going to make Biosphere 2 and then invite the question, where is Biosphere 1? So we could say very happily, it's the only one that we know about, and you're part of it. It's the planetary Earth's biosphere. We're not only going to do that, but we're going to put in a tropical rainforest, a savanna, fog deserts, actually mostly collected down in Baja California, by the way. A Everglades system that's going to replicate in a few hundred feet, 20 miles of estuary from freshwater marshes to mangroves, a living coral reef in a million-gallon ocean. A good bit of the water for that came from La Jolla because we had friends at Scripps Institution and we wanted to get really unpolluted ocean water to begin with. And we'll put 8 people in there, so they need to have a farm that is not going to use any chemicals because it's designed for 100 years. And Jakob was mentioning optimism and hope. And I think that that is a scarce resource that we really need to guard. Biosphere 2 was a very optimistic project. We knew that it wasn't going to be flawless when you plunge into the unknown and you try to start a new science called biospherics. Why don't we try to figure out how biospheres function? And we'll make a new type of laboratory where cycles are accelerated, so 1 year gives you 100 maybe residence times of the CO2, and water is accelerated hundreds of times faster because it's like a cyclotron for the life sciences, which is a quote John Allen, who's credited with coming up with the idea, a fellow director of the Institute of Ecotechnics. But let's go back 30 years. 30 years ago, most people couldn't spell the word biosphere. I know that because I spoke on the phone with lots of journalists, lots of people, and not only couldn't they spell it, but they had no real idea of what a biosphere was, what humanity's role in it. In fact, infamously, the UN had a program for many years, I think it's still running, called Man, maybe they've changed that to Humans, and the Biosphere, as if the biosphere is something outside of us that when we feel good, we can take care of, when we feel affluent, and otherwise, it's scenery. So Biosphere 2 was extremely radical. It was really radical, and we knew, to our surprise, it was going to be a quiet research facility when the world got very excited about it, because for the first time, hundreds of millions, even billions of people pre-internet were seeing a little model biosphere with people in it that they could relate to, they could get their minds about. And they started, coming by the dozens, hundreds, thousands, eventually by the hundreds of thousands to come and learn about Biosphere 2 and biospherics. The world has changed an enormous amount. Now we're starting to talk about, in serious ways, the Anthropocene and recognize that humanity is a unique species because of our impact on the planet. And the experience of living in there, I still digest. I'll preempt about my dream life. I often have dreams about going back into Biosphere 2, in space, somewhere on Earth, with my crew members, with other people, kind of this panic attack, because we didn't know how to operate a biosphere. And one of our heroes, Bucky Fuller, if you know the name, you probably know his most famous book, Operating Manual for Planet Earth. For Spaceship Earth. That's still the task of humanity. So now Biosphere 2, I think, is able to be comprehended, and the fun of it is there's a whole generation, I see mostly somewhat older people here, who remember it was front page news. Our reentry was seen by close to 1 billion people with the new technology of satellite TVs. There's a whole generation who are coming of age with this great struggle that we had foreseen. We started the Institute of Ecotechnics in the 1970s with a simple premise that we can do a lot better. We may not know the answers, but if you have respect for nature and you meet human needs while enhancing nature, that's got to be better than the system of exploitation and degradation that we now see even more multiplied. So I'm really excited. I'm very appreciative that the gallery here at UCSD has hosted this program. There's some books that I've written and other people have written. Biosphere 2 is a world that I think will fire your imagination. And of course, we call the crew Biospherians. So maybe I'll cut these remarks by saying it's really great to be together in this beautiful auditorium with a group of biospherians.
How do you do this?
Thank you, Mark. Okay, it works like this. Thank you so much. So at this point, I'd like to open the discussion to you. If you have questions, we have 2 microphones. And if you don't have questions, I have like 5. This
Shoot.
is totally up my alley. Trish is going to ask a question. Yes.
Hello. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for putting all this work together. It's lovely, and I'm sure we'll all be looking at it for several months ahead, if not more. And my question is for you all. So what happened? Why did it only last 2 or 3 years?
I guess I'm going to be the one to answer that. That's kind of a mystery. It's not a definitive answer. When we first started thinking about Biosphere 2, and of course it's a complicated story, and the media kind of forgot that it was an experiment, and it started raking us over the coals if anything unexpected happened. And when we needed to pump in oxygen, because the crew was, I was all for writing it further down, but I'm kind of an extreme human being. We did it with people with sleep apnea. We were essentially climbing a mountain, and that was touted as a great failure of Biosphere 2. And that put pressure on the financial backers. And I remember I did a PhD with H.T. Odom, whose name really should be emblazoned because he's the father of ecological engineering. I went down to University of Florida, and one day he said, I think the backers of Biosphere 2 don't realize how important that experiment was. So he was the first one that told me that's the most important ecological experiment of our time. People kind of lost sight of that. And, the usual, we had a scientific advisory committee, and I have written at length, and more volumes could be written about why Biosphere 2 is controversial. One of the ones is that, and I don't know how many practicing scientists and engineers are in the room, but basically science and engineering is dominated by analytic, quote unquote, reductionist science. And there's an outright hostility towards holistic science. Now, Biosphere 2 had to get the details right. So we had literally 5 or 10 prestigious institutions, maybe 100 PhDs, great scientific engineers working on the details, but inherently it was a holistic project because we wanted to, as I mentioned, biospherics. It's a little bit of humorous to say that 3 acres in the Arizona desert is a biosphere, but in fact, with the material closure, things were recycling. So Biosphere 2, in fact, was incredibly successful. None of the 8 of us thought that we'd actually be able to stay in there by hook or crook for 2 years. A small fire would have contaminated that small atmosphere, and we would have had to leave. Yeah, we got hungry, oxygen started mysteriously disappearing, spurred all kinds of great research. And there was kind of a falling out after, and really I feel for the second crew, because there was a second experiment that very few people remember that started about 6 months after my 2-year experiment did. And they were in there for 6 months. They actually succeeded in growing all of their food on this completely non-chemical, sustainable, regenerative agricultural system. But behind the scenes, there was this power struggle going on. And it eventuated with the financial backer taking control of the system, inviting Columbia University in, and Columbia was the first institution to then kind of dismantle Biosphere 2 as an integral biosphere, because they, contrary to all expectations, we actually had really good microcosm of a rainforest, a savanna, a coral reef ocean, a mangrove, a desert to study. And literally, this is reductionist at its most absurd, in my opinion. They hung big sheets of plastic, I call them shower curtains, pejoratively, because they wanted to study the rainforest not interacting with the ocean or the savanna. And they made Biosphere 2 a flow-through system. And, happily, because at one point it looked like it was going to get torn down for high-end real estate, Biosphere has ruined the view, apparently, which I thought would be a very karmically satisfying but tragic development. So Biosphere 2 is still being operated and is doing, some cutting-edge research. Now the University of Arizona is in charge of it. The animosity, I think part of that takeover abetted, let's say all the science that happened before we came on the scene was no good. That whole attitude has really changed. So, Biosphere 2, the 100-year experiment continues. Now we're seeing what an Ivy League university did with it. Now we're seeing what the University of Arizona is doing with it. And I harbor still hopes that Biosphere 2 will be put back together, because our dream was not only to make Biosphere 2, but enable Biosphere 3, 4, 5, 100 to be built by universities and cities as public education, as research facilities. And unlike Biosphere 2, we had the premise of a tropical biosphere, because those tropical biomes are under great pressure. The savanna is where famines happen when it gets desertified. We know the story, the battle for the rainforest of the planet. But for example, the Russians, who are the leaders in the field and who cooperated greatly with Biosphere 2, they wanted to make a polluted biosphere, Biosphere 3 in the Soviet Union, because they said that's our environment. It's poisoned. We have pollution everywhere. So you could make a biosphere and use it as a instrument to study phyto and bioremediation. How do you make the air and water clean? That quite the different premise. Our premise was we're going to get the engineers to design the technology so technology and ecology will work together. And that, to me, is one of the great lessons of Biosphere 2, that we can do that with the world's technosphere. The technology, we start to see that in energy, but go down the line. Is there any reason we have to have toxic chemicals in our food, in our manufacturing? So a whole thinking. But the short answer is the usual suspects: power and control. I made a joke to Bill Mitch, who is a professor at Ohio State, a professor of ecological engineering. And I said, Bill, I guess we've succeeded because we've made a ecological engineering facility so valuable that the usual suits and guys with guns are in to take it over.
Can I step in and append this, Mark?
Sure.
And yeah, because I'd say, having known you for as long as I have, which is, not since Biosphere 2, but I was a kid. I remember this all. And having spent almost 5 years in science communication for the Santa Fe Institute, and, thinking about the way that they understand themselves as an organization of complex systems theorists, I think that as a third party, as an observer, it seems like a lot of the tragedy of Biosphere 2 not getting to be what it was intended to be was due to a failure in, or it's like a tragic collision between the way that people understand science in a kind of like a pop cultural way, and the way that the media grabs a story and wants winners and losers, and it wants drama, it wants failure, and then the reality of what you actually were doing. You all were so incredibly ambitious to take, because people think about an experiment and they think that an experiment succeeds or it fails, right? And that's the kind of destination preordained logic that circumscribes a lot of what does actually constitute science now in the 21st century. Big scientific projects like we're looking for the vaccine, or we're trying to find gravity waves, and we did it. We found the gravity waves. But when you're dealing with complexity, the point, as I always understood it, of Biosphere 2 was to, am I allowed to use coarse language here?
No.
Okay. Well, then to mess around and find out, right? Like to get everything dialed in, and then to, you were talking about the oxygen dropped more than you thought. It was because somewhere in there they hadn't calculated the off-gassing of the concrete from the concrete pylons, right? So it's it's the same thing with, right at that same time, Jurassic Park came out, the movie, and that entered the public consciousness, and the book was written while you guys were building this thing, and that is the very much there's a passage in that book, because I was just rereading it, about how they said building Jurassic Park was less like building a zoo and more like building a space station, and it's that's exactly what this is. This is where, and possibly, like you said, for similar reasons, power, control, and then ultimately, it wasn't an amusement park. It was virtuous in a way that Jurassic Park would not have been, because it was something that was understood to be a source of learning through that which you did not already know at the outset of the experiment. And I think that's something that people still to this day just don't really understand about, what it means to experiment on complex systems. And it's something that I've always loved about what you all deigned to accomplish with this.
Thank you so much, Michael. We have 2 questions lined up from our audience, so in the interest of time, I'm going to give the mic to Amy and then Ricardo.
Sorry, I fumbled it. There we go. Thanks, everybody. This is great. And I was kind of thinking about Jakob's introduction and the different doomsday bunkers, and that in contrast with Biosphere 2. And I'm also, it kind of made me think of these places in between that were fantasy doomsday bunkers, people would have swimming pools and strip clubs and things like that in them. And I'm kind of thinking about this and thinking about the next biosphere and where we are in time. Where society is much more virtual environment literate, right? Everybody looks at that and thinks, that you could do that in Minecraft or the metaverse or something. Oh, it was real. That's right. So I guess I'm wondering, what will the next biosphere be like? And, how will that be different? How will it play out in a culture that's now both more understanding of it scientifically and the reasoning for it, but also culturally is kind of more, I think, engaged with the possibilities of these enclosed environments?
Yeah, I think that's going to be exciting to see for sure. Hopefully, as Mark said, Biosphere 2 will come back together in some point or the other. But I think the possibilities are quite vast. I think one thing that is also a part of the whole Biosphere 2 project was to think nature and technology together, and I think that's going to be the next frontier. Like, how can we build new biospheres where the technology of today will be incorporated into developing new nature scenarios that will allow us to understand nature in new ways and explore them, basically. I mean, I think one thing that's often forgotten about Biosphere 2 is you talk a lot about the nature part of it, but there was also a whole information system around it. It was not informationally closed. You were communicating with the outside all the time. You were watching television inside. You were communicating over something like the primitive version of the internet.
2,000 sensors inside too.
Right.
Streams of data.
Yeah. So I think that for me, that's really going to be the interesting part in seeing how the sciences of today or the technologies of today, whatever they might be, not only the social media or internet based, but all sorts of technologies can be incorporated into dreaming up a new Biosphere 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, whatever number you want to give it.
I mean, it's ironic because we're flanked by or sitting next to a great artist and biothinker who's into imaginary creatures.
Right.
But you know, when I give talks around the world, I kind of think that the future is the relationship that we make with the planet's biosphere, and I think we're sort of coming of age where we're starting to even ask the right questions. But I think there's really such pervasive misunderstanding that here we are in this auditorium, that all of the life on planet Earth is supplying our oxygen, is recycling our water. I mean, I often have audiences just stop and take a breath or two and start to think about that you are metabolically contributing. You are, you know, even when you're dead, you're decomposing and you're part of the biosphere. In fact, the biosphere lives on the necrosphere. You know, there's so much imagination that, you know, the new frontier, I think, is not necessarily, of course, I want to see other of these amazing facilities built and with, you know, with temperate biomes, with Arctic ones. You know, the possibilities are endless, but I think the real challenge is, as I was saying before, most people really don't understand that they're part of the biosphere. They're thinking that the environment is something outside of them. And I think it's part of the reason, you know, one of the saddest things I've ever read about is nature separation as a psychological ailment. And I see it everywhere. I really see it everywhere. And it starts in your own brain, that you don't understand that you are a child of the biosphere and your every action is part of this enormous symphony of the biosphere. And it's true that, you know, human technology is incredibly sophisticated and God bless it. But, you know, we have been so irresponsible in not really dealing with the consequences of inflicting that technology, economic systems, and now we're starting to see the impacts. An unhealthy biosphere means an unhealthy human population. And one of the beauties, the experience of being in Biosphere 2, was in that small world that was so present. You know, mindfulness, you know, every day you were mindful that you needed to go and be a thoughtful farmer to grow food for your next meals. You need to go into the rainforest and the other biomes, one, to be inspired by the beauty, and our job was to protect biodiversity. You know, we're not going to let morning glories like wipe out 20% of the rainforest species. Really beautiful roles, because I have a real disdain for the deep ecologists who say, humans were just a parasitic cancer on the planet. Screw that. We have a much greater affinity. We evolved as humans totally in nature. The Industrial Revolution is still an eye drop, 300 years, and we've created this world that hypnotizes us to forgetting how natural we are.
Thank you so much. There was another question.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so sorry to have been late. I apologize, and I'm going to have to run out again. But I was wondering, to me, this project was a part of an arc, I would say, of a child born, into the late 50s, early 60s. I remember the first image of a biosphere being Superman having Krypton inside a sphere that he would keep healthy and strong. And then I saw Buckminster Fuller's images on television, black and white. And I grew up in Las Vegas, and that was a kind of biome of artificial simulation, right? You could go into Paris or New York. Water systems were created, if you will. And a film that emerged by Douglas Trumbull, the special effects director of 2001, I believe it was around the same time as the first Earth Day. It was called Silent Running. And it was about biodomes out in space. And it was about the maintenance and mindfulness of an avant-gardener of the future, right? A future farmer taking care of these biospheres out in deep space. And of course, the terror of that project is that they have to be destroyed for reasons of corporate valiancies. One isn't quite sure. So I was wondering, pardon me, if that speculative culture, like Silent Running, influenced the sort of impulse of Biosphere project for all of you.
Well, some journalists have written it, but the truth is that we didn't know that movie. And I have a kind of a personal connection. I was a director of the project and all that, but I hadn't decided that I really wanted to be a biospherian. We had a group, a cadre of people training, hoping to be selected for one mission or another. I spent 24 hours in our test module where this absolute certainty and overpowering knowledge that I was part of this ecosystem metabolism really was undeniable. And they piped in Silent Running for my amusement at night after I had finished my activities. Later on in the project, a lot of the both people who acted in it, the producer and director, came to Biosphere 2. So it was parallel tracks, and of course the media not only forgot that it was an experiment of voyage into the unknown, but they also really preferred to do the space scenario. And it's true. If we're going to live in space, we're going to need to figure out eventually how to make biospheres, because that's the unit that we and all other Earth life, live in. But Biosphere 2 is equally an Earth project.
Thank you so much. I saw another hand there for questions. Yes.
Yes, so my question is for Michael. Was there any role of improvisation in your musical contribution to Biosphere? I mean, I see things like peregrine falcons that, nest in high-rise buildings in New York City, to let's say something more natural like the barred owl that moved into greater Seattle in the late 1970s and took over, well, not took over, but adapted using pileated woodpecker, nests in dead Douglas firs.
Oh, yeah. I mean, so improv has been the core of my work. I do a lot of composition, but it constituted the vast majority of my musical work for 20 years. And I have a background I have a degree from the University of Kansas in ecology and evolutionary biology. And I love this term that Stephen Jay Gould and Elizabeth Verba coined this term exaptation, which is an adaptation that repurposes something that was once conferring some kind of fitness advantage in one environment, but then you move the organism into a new context, and then it suddenly does something else. And the classic example of this would be, the limb, which was not, in the way that we think. Again, like to think about these, like the way that people misunderstand science experiments, right? This is not something that evolved to walk on land, right? It happened, and then it happened to confer a benefit to organisms living in a turbulent intertidal zone. And then they got washed up on land, and it happened to help them get back into the water. And really, like, all creative work is this way. And so, I think that the joy of doing music for a project like this is in getting to partake in the same spirit of curiosity and discovery as the members of the Institute of Ecotechnics, because like they, I really do think that, like you're saying, I think of all of these birds that live in urban spaces, and I think of, we have domesticated ourselves with technologies and the ways that we have extended ourselves through technologies, and how it really does challenge this concept. And I think just as somebody who's in sort of, who came up, in the wake of what Mark and everyone else was doing there, I feel very lucky to be of a generation that I think has more of a sort of an innate understanding of the fact that these categories are no longer serving us as they once seemed to have. That we are all in some way cyborgs and or falcons, rooking in the bell tower of a church. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, Michael. Do we have other questions? If not, okay, we have one from Ramesh.
Hi, thanks. So I had a question about how life in Biosphere 2 affected you at a sort of a psychological, mental level. 10 years ago, if somebody were to tell me that we could get addicted to watching video clips that are 60 seconds long and return to that experience night after night, I would have laughed it off, right? But this was such a compact space. Do you find yourself hanging out in certain locations? This is almost like the spatial equivalent of these short video clips, right? You could experience very different spaces in a very compact environment. How did you respond to that? How did it influence you, affect you? How did you react to that?
I mean, Biosphere 2 was a very all-encompassing experience. So I could answer by, people did have their favorite places. Almost everyone really loved the rainforest because it became very quickly so dense that you could sit there and be 10 feet from a window where thousands of people are going by with a tour guide being explained, and you're in a different world, maybe watching a hooting galago, or people would go to the desert and come back, and you could tell by the smell that they were in the desert because it was stacked full, as deserts are, of very fragrant aromatic things. There was also, of course, the human dimension of only having physical contact. And as Jakob said, we didn't want to make it like an isolation, so we had unlimited, as astronauts do in space. We could call friends or anyone. And if you said, I'm calling from Biosphere 2, I was arranging conferences from there. You got through a lot of secretaries really quickly. But living with only 8 people is really difficult. Even as diverse a group because we had to have people with expertise in marine biology and terrestrial biology, a doctor who over specialized but became a GP for the experiment. But living in a small group is difficult, and it got even worse because the power struggle on the outside about the future of the project polarized us. And because we had been at Institute of Ecotechnic Projects, life and death in the Australian outback, or on our research ship, the Heraclitus, we were used to that kind of thing. One of the really interesting things in Biosphere 2 was that we talked through those problems. We put them on the table. We even reread a book that I highly recommend, Experiences in Groups, about the task group and these unconscious groups, which have colorful names like kill the leader, pairing, fight, flight, dependency. We actually reread that, once a week at our meetings. And the other factor was that everyone was committed to both the success of the project and to maximizing as much research. And it was not just a metaphor, it was our lifeboat. So what often happens in exploration is these tensions go underground and people sabotage each other. They sabotage the overall research. People have died on expeditions because of these forces. So even at the worst of the interpersonal relations, we all continued working flawlessly with each other. And it gives me hope. I come back and, great revelation. Every human group is dysfunctional to some extent. I went back into the universities and I couldn't believe the rivalries and animosity between professors, not to mention the students. So this is a given in human affairs. The question is whether, we as a planetary species now can override those cultural differences, chemistry differences. Somebody's phlegmatic, somebody's sanguine, all of those things that are difficult to reconcile. Because I think we're the first generation, from us older guys to the youngins, who really understand the stakes, that we have one biosphere and it's destructively being tested.
Can I just add a little bit to that? Because I think
Yes.
one of the things that caught my attention to Mark's experience inside Biosphere 2 is, well, not Biosphere 2, but the test module. You mentioned it just a little bit earlier, was how much this was a physical sensation. And I remember when you first told me about that experience of being inside the test module, and within minutes almost, you felt like your body was one with the ecosystem. My first thought was, I want to remake the test module, and we were actually thinking about that, not for this exhibition, but from another exhibition. And what really fascinated me was this idea how the physical sensation of your body being one with the system is such a precious one, and one that I wish that everyone in this room and basically around the world could have, because I think that experience is something that people rarely have, because their bodies are anesthetized in various ways, and they don't feel that, have never felt that connection to the biosphere, so that's really, I think, apart from all the other experiences, I think that's maybe the one experience I was most fascinated by and most envious of. I wish I could have that experience. Hopefully one day I'll get the chance.
I learned about it maybe a decade after leaving Biosphere 2. The Japanese have a really ancient tradition that apparently 60% of the population do, and it's basically forest bathing. they go out to forest environments to, kind of get that connection going again. And I think, this is kind of common knowledge of, if we scratch away the modern techno-obsessed human being, that every culture, because every culture loves nature. Every culture, pretty much until the really dysfunctional ones that we have to deal with, they understood you can't destroy this. Nature is sacred in so many cultures. Now, of course, they're called pagans and heathens, but I think we're all pagans really deep inside, and we know that our health and our connection is real. I mean, I grew up in New York City, and I have to say, I grew up in Queens. Everyone talks about Central Park, and I can't imagine the psychic health of Manhattaners without having Central Park. But I grew up in a pretty urban environment, and those parks were a godsend. And just as a little kid, you knew going to those parks, riding bikes, playing tennis, digging for worms. This is human life. This is the stuff that credit cards and bank accounts absolutely do not capture nor replace.
Well, thank you so much. Mark, this is now 6:04, and according to our schedule, we have a reception, but I couldn't get to ask my questions. So if the audience is okay, I'll ask a question or two. The first one is to you, Jacob, about what motivated you, and this will have to be short. And the second one is to Mark. You said that if you live in a world overcome with disasters, architects have to deal with it, dealing with the horror mostly. I'm trained as an architect. Mm-hmm. I come from a family of architects. And just on February 6th, a big portion of Turkey was affected by a major earthquake. It's known as the Turkey-Syria earthquake. It took about 200,000 people. The local numbers the government numbers are much, they don't reflect the severity of the situation. But as an architect, I immediately felt responsible. So I really think that you nailed something there. And starting the book with, I even look at this beautiful cover, like the first, font that you're using is a horror font. So, this has become a profession that deals with, these kind of horror. So I just want to ask you, also it's, speculative fiction. What was your basically main motivation? And, kind of with this institute that you're talking about. So that's your question. Now, to Mark, I'm just going to ask both of them at once. There are a lot of architectural competitions right now funded by European Union that end up in my mailbox. And most of them use this term like eco-cities. The last one is called Hungry Eco-Cities, where they literally urge architects to think about systems like this, right? But the buzzword is AI, right? And when I saw the title Biosphere Dreaming, I also immediately thought about how a lot of people, especially in the arts and cultural production, approach AI with this theme of dreaming. AI dreams, the artworks are dreaming, there's a subconscious, and it cracks me up a lot because I do have a background in neuroscience, so I know that that's really not happening in the context of AI. But biosphere dreaming it's legit, right? So as someone who experienced this with your own, body as a physical experience, as a physical sensation, which definitely, built new cells in you with the food that you grew there, with the people around you. How do you see the incorporation of artificial intelligences in, near future examples of this? So 2 questions. Sorry, audience, but we're still here. Jacob, we'll start with you.
Well, there's a lot of inspiration, but I think one thing that I wanted to look at in the book is when we're building for the future, we are building not only to survive, but also to live. And I think sometimes a lot of this disaster architecture deals more with surviving and forgets living. And it's a very clear experience I had. I think it must have been when I was in Berlin as a teenager, and we went to visit the bunkers in Berlin that Hitler had built in the case of attack on the city. And apart from these bunkers only being able to host 40,000 people, a lot less than was living in Berlin at the time, meaning that only a very small part of the population would be able to go in there. The life that you would have when you got into these bunkers was not a life that I would live. Basically, I would probably stay above ground because that was really basically they could only live there for 3 days and then they would be unlivable. So I think this question of going through, looking at some of these attempts to survive that has some kind of rationality but forgets the part of what it means to live, because it's such an important part of these bunker ideas. I mean, whether is it the dream to just have a luxury house 20 meters underground like they're doing in London now? I don't know if that's really how we're gonna live after how we're gonna build for the future, and that's when I look to something like Biosphere 2 was definitely concerned with living, and having a different vision of a survivalist architecture. So in short, that I think that's was my fascination. Looking the evil in the eye, which are these projects that try to just basically build a fortress around people, and then because that's out there, loaded with politics in various ways, and then there are other visions like like Biosphere 2 that I thought, okay, that's a different way to go about it, and maybe we should start incorporating some of the experiences from that in how we build going forward.
Thank you.
Oh, Pinar, can I just say really quickly, I'm so glad you brought up Turkey, because, there's that, I don't know how many people know about this, but Derinkuyu, right? The enormous mysterious underground city in Turkey that guy found when he was like doing demo work on his basement. And they say that it was thousands of years old. It could have held up to, like 18,000 people. And there's been something about this, and it's such a mystery. What was it that people were so afraid of up there that people were committed?
President Erdogan's ancestor. They were afraid of a tyrant. They were running away from him. That's a joke. I'm joking.
So, but it's like, but there's, but there's like, you go back all the way to the Great Oxidation event of 2 billion years ago. And I think a lot of this stuff that we're playing through now that Jakob is speaking to is almost like residual trauma from the formation of the atmosphere that all of us take for granted now, where all of the anaerobic microbes were forced into the insides of complex organisms or underground through the suffusion of oxygen into the atmosphere through photosynthesis. And so we're all kind of just endlessly replaying this bifurcation into the above ground dwelling and the bunker dwelling forks of the biosphere. And I see Biosphere 2 as the only truly ennobling course as far as that the below ground fork is concerned. But yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Well, I have a complete ignorance of AI, so I'm going to leave that part of it. Although it seems to me like any human invention, it kind of depends on what we tell AI to do, and then it becomes pretty variable what the results are going to be. But I have to say, I hate that media just obliterates us with bad news all the time. because there's so many good things happening. And one of the things that I really love is this whole idea of greening cities. I was in Perth about a decade ago. There was a series of CASE conferences, and it was cities as sustainable ecosystems. And I was presenting because one of my aspects that came out of Biosphere 2 was being someone who works with human waste, sewage, and turns it into wastewater gardens and all that. So I was speaking on that, but I was really listening to all of the other people, and they were making the very simple point, and I think we're not going to go back, we're not Rousseauians, most people are not going to, give up creature comforts, and, and we can't hunt and gather in the numbers, it's all fantasy. But what we can do is bring our love of life into the cities. And cities can be, rooftops can be gardens. I know a friend who's got one of the companies doing living walls, and I've seen them on a London street. I was waiting for a flight in one of the Paris airports, and to my joy, there was this huge living wall that made that part of the airport so my organism finally breathed. By the way, if you live in a green environment and then you go into one of our cities, the first thing you notice, and I'm really glad that Jakob, it's very profound. We are shallow breathers if we live in toxic environments, and virtually everybody does. Anyway, at that conference, they were basically saying that what is driving the human impact on the biosphere are cities. Now a majority of humans live in cities. That keeps on growing. So the question is, how do we use architecture, biology, greenery, regenerative agriculture to change the nature of cities? When I dream of time travel, one of my big ones is let's go back before cars dominated and drove humans off of the streets. Now, it's true that horseshit was amassing at, really alarming rates in places like New York City, and pigs were part of the sewage disposal. But I just long for, what is the world when we humans who are naturally life, and we are life-loving beings. If we actually put human needs, there wouldn't be a great conflict with local ecosystems and the environment. So that the question, the challenge, I think, for architects, I'm not dealing with disasters. We need to make buildings much better. And by the way, our architects put a hotel into Kathmandu that survived when 90% of the buildings. It can be done. But the real challenge, I think, is that quality of life. And I am wired to be an optimist, because if you're not an optimist, then you don't think you can make a difference. And I've seen that all through my life, but certainly in Biosphere 2, we said to each other, there are no small actions in here. You can see the ramifications in a closed system so much faster, but there are ramifications everywhere. So we need to redesign technology to where it doesn't pollute. And we need to redesign cities to where they're green as hell, and it's a joy to be in them.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. And on this positive note, I'd like to thank all of you for coming here, being with us. And I'd like to thank our participants for being here and creating this wonderful conversation. Thank you all. The reception is outside.
Thank you.